My father was a man who believed in foundations. In his work as a structural engineer and in his life, he taught me that the most impressive skyscraper is nothing without the unseen, unglamorous strength of the concrete and steel buried deep in the earth. He built his life on the foundations of honesty, hard work, and a quiet, steadfast love for his family. When my mother died, that foundation cracked, but it did not break. But when he brought Valerie home, he unwittingly invited a demolition crew into our lives. Valerie was a masterpiece of soft surfaces and sharp angles, all flowing silks, gentle smiles, and a voice like warm honey. She mourned my mother with a theatrical grief that seemed more profound than my own quiet, aching loss. My father, lonely and lost in his own sorrow, saw a fellow soul in need of comfort. I saw an opportunist. I saw the way her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, would scan our comfortable home not with warmth, but with a cold, calculating appraisal. It was the look of a wolf admiring a well-stocked sheep pen. They were married within a year. My father's last 5 years were, I have to believe, happy ones. Valerie was an attentive, charming wife. She filled the house with flowers and laughter and friends. She learned to talk about load-bearing walls and tensile strength with a convincing sincerity. I played my part. I was the dutiful daughter, polite and distant. I never trusted her. My father, in his quiet way, knew it. Give her a chance, Eli, he'd say. She's just trying to build a life with us. But she wasn't building. She was waiting. When the cancer took him, it was swift and brutal. In the blur of his final weeks, Valerie was the perfect angel of mercy, managing his care, his visitors, his affairs. I was just his daughter, holding his hand, my heart breaking with every ragged breath he took. His death left a crater in my world so vast I thought it would swallow me whole. The will reading was 2 weeks after the funeral. We sat in a sterile, wood-paneled office. Me, Valerie, and my father's lawyer, Mr. Davies. It was supposed to be simple. My father's foundation was built on fairness. The house, his pension, his portfolio all to be split evenly between his loving wife and his only child. But then Mr. Davies cleared his throat and read a final codicil, an amendment I had never seen before, signed 3 months prior, when the illness had already begun to cloud his mind. It stipulated that a separate investment account, one I barely knew existed, was to be left entirely to Valerie. It was, the document stated, to ensure her comfort and security for the remainder of her years. I stared at the lawyer, my mind numb. That account wasn't just a rainy day fund. It was the bulk of my father's liquid assets. It was the fruits of his entire career. My inheritance, over $2 million. I don't understand, I stammered. He never mentioned. Valerie reached across the table and placed her cool hand on mine. Her eyes were full of a deep, convincing sorrow. Oh, sweetheart, she said, her voice a gentle balm. He didn't want to worry you. It was a surprise. He told me he was so afraid of me being alone, of me having to struggle after he was gone. It was his last gift to me. She looked at Mr. Davies. He was always so thoughtful, wasn't he? It was a perfect performance. I looked from her sorrowful face to the lawyer's sympathetic one. I was being painted as the greedy, ungrateful daughter, questioning my sainted father's final wishes. The gaslighting was so subtle, so expert, I almost believed it myself. But I knew my father. I knew his foundation. And this was a lie that had just stolen my future. In the weeks following the will reading, I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Valerie was swift and efficient. The investment account was liquidated and transferred to her personal name before I could even formulate a proper challenge. I consulted a lawyer of my own, a woman who listened patiently and then gave me the grim reality. The codicil is legally sound, she said, her expression full of pity. It's his signature. Proving undue influence or diminished capacity after the fact is nearly impossible and incredibly expensive. You'd be fighting for years, with a very slim chance of success. Valerie, meanwhile, was putting on a masterclass in performative grief. She sold our family home, telling everyone it was too full of memories for her to bear. She held a tearful estate sale, getting rid of my father's worn leather armchair, my mother's collection of antique maps, the sturdy dining table where we'd shared thousands of meals. She was erasing my history, piece by piece. And then, 3 months after my father's death, came the final, glittering insult. A friend sent me a link to a real estate blog featuring notable sales in the area. And there it was. A sprawling, modern monstrosity of glass and white stone, with an infinity pool overlooking a canyon. The sale price, $2.8 million. The proud new owner, the article gushed, was Valerie Jansen, a grieving widow graciously starting her next chapter. The photos were what broke me. There she was, smiling on the vast marble patio, a glass of champagne in her hand. She was hosting a party, not a somber memorial, but a lavish housewarming, filled with dozens of her fashionable, laughing friends. She had taken my father's life's work, his legacy, my legacy, and converted it into a flashy monument to her own greed. She wasn't just living in a new house. She was living in my inheritance. That night, something inside me shifted. The grief that had paralyzed me began to cool and harden into something else. It was an anger so cold and so pure it felt like a religious calling. The lawyer was right. I couldn't fight her for the money she had stolen. The legal fortress she and my father's signature had built was too strong. A frontal assault was impossible. But as I stared at the picture of her, so smug and untouchable in her stolen palace, a new thought began to form. A foundation. Every structure has one, and every foundation has a weakness. I wasn't going to sue her. I wasn't going to scream at her. I was going to find the weakness in the foundation of her new life, and I was going to bring the whole damned house down. My new obsession began in my father's old office, a room I had insisted on clearing out myself. Valerie had been all too happy to let me, eager to have the last vestiges of his real work, the boring stuff, out of her sight. For weeks, I sat surrounded by his old blueprints, his financial ledgers, his textbooks on soil mechanics and structural load. I wasn't looking for a hidden will or a secret account. I was looking for a lesson. My father had taught me how to build things. Now, I needed to learn how to expertly, methodically, and legally take something apart. I started digging into Valerie, not with private investigators, but with public records, deeds, tax assessments, corporate filings. I was a financial analyst by trade. Digging through data was my specialty. I pulled the property records for her new glass palace. As I suspected, the sale was recorded for $2.8 million. The transfer documents showed the bulk of it had been paid in cash, from a cashier's check drawn on the same bank that had held my father's investment account. It was a direct, clear line from my inheritance to her front door. But then I found something interesting. A discrepancy. The house was $2.8 million, but the cash transfer was for just over $2.1 million. A lot of money, yes, but there was a $700,000 gap. I kept digging, and there it was, filed a day after the main deed. A mortgage, not from a major national bank, but from a small, private lending group I'd never heard of, Clearwater Capital Investments. My heart started to beat faster. This was a weakness. Why would she get a mortgage if she had the cash? I pieced it together. She hadn't just bought the house. She had gutted it. New floors, new kitchen, that infinity pool, and the furniture, the art, the landscaping. She had spent every last cent of my father's money, and then some. She had needed a loan to cover the extravagant finishes, the final layer of polish on her stolen life. And because she likely had no real income of her own, a big bank would have turned her down. So she went to a private lender, one who would care more about the value of the asset, the house itself, than the borrower's ability to pay. They'd give her a high-interest loan, secured by a property they knew was worth millions. It was a risk for her, but a great deal for them. And that's when the idea, in all its cold, terrifying, and beautiful brilliance, struck me. I couldn't take the house from her directly, but a mortgage is just a debt, and debts, like any other asset, can be bought and sold. The mortgage note, the legal document that represented her debt, was an asset owned by Clearwater Capital Investments. If I could buy that note, I would cease to be the victim of her theft. I would become her lender. I would become her bank. She would owe me money, every single month. She would be living in my father's house, but she would be paying rent to his daughter. A slow, cold smile spread across my face for the first time in months. The plan was insane. It was audacious. It would take every penny I had left from the smaller part of my inheritance, plus my own life savings. It was a monumental risk, but the thought of it, the thought of Valerie, sitting in her glass palace, unknowingly sending a check to me every month. It wasn't just about justice anymore. It was poetry. To pull this off, I needed a guide, someone who understood the labyrinthine world of private debt and real estate law. There was only one person I trusted, Arthur Vance, my father's oldest friend and for many years, his personal lawyer before he retired. He was a sharp, curmudgeonly man who had always looked at Valerie with a thinly veiled suspicion. I laid out the entire plan for him in his dusty, book-lined study. I showed him the property records, the mortgage filing, my research on Clearwater Capital. He listened in silence, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth, his eyes sharp and focused over his reading glasses. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Let me get this straight," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. "You want to take the entirety of your remaining inheritance and your personal savings, and use it to purchase a high-risk, non-performing adjacent mortgage note from a second-tier private lender. Also, you can become the lien holder on the property of the woman who stole your money in the first place." "Yes," I said, my voice steady. He stared at me, and then he did something I had never seen him do before. He threw his head back and let out a great, booming laugh. "By God, you're your father's daughter, all right," he chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. He would have appreciated the sheer, beautiful, legalistic audacity of it. "It's the most cold-blooded, elegant, and frankly terrifying revenge scheme I've ever heard. I love it." Arthur's enthusiasm was the validation I needed. He agreed to help, to be the legal mind behind the operation. Our first step was to create a layer of anonymity. We couldn't have me, Lara Vance, trying to buy the note. Valerie would be notified of the sale, and she'd fight it tooth and nail. So, Arthur drew up the paperwork for a new limited liability company, an LLC, a shell corporation with a deliberately bland and forgettable name. We settled on Peregrine Holdings LLC. I chose the name myself. A peregrine falcon is a patient hunter. It circles high above, unseen, watching its prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The next step was the most delicate, approaching Clearwater Capital. Arthur made the call. He framed it as a simple business proposition from an investment group, Peregrine Holdings, looking to acquire seasoned mortgage notes to add to their portfolio. He didn't mention me or Valerie. It was just one corporation talking to another. The owner of Clearwater, a man named Marcus Thorne, was intrigued. For him, the mortgage on Valerie's house was a good asset, but it was illiquid. It was money tied up for 30 years. Arthur, on behalf of Peregrine, offered to buy the note from him, in cash, for a small but immediate profit. We were offering him a quick, clean payday. The negotiation took weeks. Thorne was a shark, and he smelled an eager buyer. He pushed the price up. Every new number he quoted sent me into a panic, forcing me to recalculate my finances, to see if I could still afford it. It was a high-stakes poker game, and I was betting my entire future. Finally, after 3 nerve-wracking weeks, we settled on a price. It was 5% more than I had budgeted. It would take every last dollar I had in the world. I would be left with nothing but my salary and the ownership of my stepmother's debt. "Are you sure about this, Eli?" Arthur asked, his voice serious, the night before we were due to wire the money. "Once this is done, there's no going back. You'll be all in." I thought of my father. I thought of Valerie laughing in her stolen house. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said. The next morning, Peregrine Holdings LLC wired $782,451 to Clearwater Capital Investments. The grenade was purchased. The pin was pulled. All I had to do now was wait for it to land in Valerie's lap. The transfer of a mortgage note is a quiet, bureaucratic event. There are no trumpets, no grand announcements, just a series of documents filed with the county clerk. But for me, the day the sale was finalized was more significant than any holiday. I was no longer just Lara Vance, grieving daughter. I was Peregrine Holdings LLC. I was Valerie's creditor. The first official communication was a simple, legally required letter. Arthur's firm drafted and sent it. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored letterhead with the Peregrine Holdings logo. I had designed myself a stylized, soaring falcon. The letter informed Mrs. Valerie Jansen that her mortgage, loan number 70 for B912, had been sold. It detailed the new payment instructions, directing her to send her monthly check for $4,819.3 for dollars to a new P.O. box, a P.O. box I had opened the week before. I imagined her receiving it. She wouldn't think twice about the name. She'd probably be annoyed at the inconvenience, at having to update her automatic bill pay. The idea that her recently deceased husband's daughter was behind This blandly corporate entity would be so far outside the realm of her imagination that it simply wouldn't exist. Her arrogance was my greatest asset. The first check arrived 3 weeks later. I drove to the post office, my heart pounding with a strange mixture of dread and exhilaration. I unlocked the small metal door of the P.O. box, and there it was, an innocuous-looking business envelope. Inside was a check, drawn on Valerie Jansen's personal account, made out to Peregrine Holdings LLC. The signature was a flamboyant, self-important scrawl. I held it in my hands, staring at her signature. This was real. My plan had worked. This piece of paper was a tangible piece of my victory. It was a fraction of the money she had stolen, being paid back to me under the guise of a mortgage payment. I drove to the bank and deposited it into the LLC's new account. It was the most satisfying $4,000 of my life. For the next year, the cycle continued with a quiet, methodical rhythm. Every month, a check would arrive. Every month, I would deposit it. I lived my life. I worked. I saw my friends. I started dating Arthur's nephew, a kind architect named Michael who knew nothing of my secret war. To the world, I was just a woman rebuilding her life after loss. No one knew that I was also a patient predator, circling high above my unsuspecting prey. I watched her, of course, from a distance. Her social media was a constant stream of self-congratulatory posts. There she was, hosting a charity luncheon by the infinity pool. There she was, showing off a new, ridiculously expensive sculpture for her foyer. There she was, on a lavish trip to Tuscany, a trip I knew she couldn't afford. I saved screenshots of it all. It was evidence. Evidence of a lifestyle built on a crumbling foundation of debt and stolen money. Every boastful post, every extravagant purchase, was another nail in her own coffin. She was spending, and I was saving. She was celebrating, and I was waiting. Because I knew, with the certainty of an engineer reading a stress report, that a structure like that cannot stand forever. It was only a matter of time before the first crack appeared. The first crack appeared 14 months after I bought the debt. The check for March didn't arrive on the 1st of the month, or the 5th. On the 10th, a notification was automatically generated by the software Arthur had set up for the LLC. A polite, formal letter was sent to Valerie, informing her that her payment was past due and that a late fee of $50 had been assessed. The check arrived a week later, along with the late fee, and a short, scrawled note at the bottom of the payment coupon. Sorry, lost track of time. In Aspen, I smiled. It was exactly the kind of casual, arrogant dismissal I had expected. This payment, this debt, was a nuisance to her, a minor annoyance in her glittering life. She wasn't worried. She should have been. 2 months later, she missed a payment entirely. No check arrived for May. The formal notices began to escalate, exactly as the law prescribed. Each letter was a little more serious, the language a little more stark. Notice of delinquency. Notice of default. Each one was sent via certified mail, requiring a signature, creating an official paper trail that she could not deny receiving. Through my uncle, who still had some contact with her side of the family, I heard whispers. Valerie had invested a large sum of money with a financial guru who had promised her spectacular returns. The guru and her money had vanished. She was, my uncle said, cash poor. She was trying to sell some of the expensive art and furniture she had bought, but was getting pennies on the dollar. The foundation was crumbling. The final legal step before foreclosure was the notice of intent to accelerate. This was the most serious letter yet. It informed her that if she did not cure the default by paying the full amount of the missed payments, plus all accumulated fees within 30 days, the entire loan balance would become due immediately. All $700,000 of it. It was the financial equivalent of a death sentence. This time she reacted. A frantic call came into the dedicated phone line for Peregrine Holdings, a number that forwarded to a virtual receptionist service Arthur had hired. Valerie was hysterical, demanding to speak to the person in charge. The receptionist, following her script perfectly, informed her that all communication must be in writing. Valerie screamed. She threatened. She cried. It was all logged. She hired a lawyer, who sent a formal letter to Peregrine Holdings, requesting a loan modification. Arthur, writing as counsel for the LLC, replied with a cold, formal rejection. Peregrine Holdings, he wrote, was not in a position to renegotiate the terms of the original agreement. The terms were the terms: pay or face foreclosure. Her lawyer wrote back, this time pleading. Mrs. Jansen was a widow who had fallen on hard times. Surely the lender could find some compassion? Arthur's reply was a single, devastating sentence. Peregrine Holdings is an investment firm, not a charity. The 30 days expired. No payment was made. I took a deep breath, called Arthur, and gave the order. File the foreclosure. The falcon was done circling. It was time to dive. The foreclosure process is a slow, grinding machine of legal paperwork. It's designed to be deliberate, to give the homeowner every possible chance to make things right. But Valerie was out of chances. She was out of money. And now, she was out of time. The day she was officially served with the foreclosure papers, a process server knocking on the door of her glass palace and handing her the thick manila envelope was, I imagined, a very bad day for her. She fought it, of course. Her lawyer filed motions to delay, claiming procedural errors, anything to slow the inevitable. Each motion was met with a swift, surgically precise legal response from Arthur. We had been meticulous. Every I was dotted, every T was crossed. Our case was a fortress. Her attempts to fight it were like throwing pebbles against a granite wall. The court dates were set. The final judgment was entered. The foreclosure was granted. The house, my house, was scheduled for a public auction on the steps of the county courthouse in a month's time. It was during this period that Valerie must have finally done the digging she should have done a year ago. She must have hired a private investigator, or had her lawyer pull the corporate filings for Peregrine Holdings. Because one evening, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and my blood ran cold. It was Valerie. She looked like a ghost. Her face was pale and drawn. Her expensive clothes looked rumpled. And her eyes were filled with a wild, desperate fury. I opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged. Hello, Valerie, I said, my voice calm. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently for a moment. The pieces were finally clicking into place in her mind. The bland LLC, the unyielding corporate responses. Me, you, she finally whispered, her voice trembling. Peregrine Holdings, that's you. This has all been you. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Don't you lie to me, she shrieked, her composure shattering. She lunged at the door, rattling the chain. You did this to me. You're taking my home. Correction, I said, and my voice was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. I am foreclosing on a property for which the owner has failed to make payment on a legally binding loan. It's just business. Business? She screeched, her face contorted with rage. You call this business? This is revenge. This is sick. You're a monster, Lara. A sick, vengeful monster. I looked at her, at this woman who had smiled at my father's funeral, who had stolen the fruits of his entire life to buy herself a palace, who had left me with nothing but grief and a legal bill. I felt nothing, no anger, no pity, just a vast empty calm. You have a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation, Valerie, I said, my voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable finality. You see me as the monster, but I'm not. I'm the consequence. I am the direct and unavoidable result of your own actions. You built your house on a foundation of theft and lies. Did you really think it would stand forever? I closed the door on her sputtering, furious face, leaving her alone on my doorstep with the ruins of her life. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with the exhilarating, terrifying thrill of victory. The house was not yet mine, but the battle was over. I had won. The day of the auction was gray and overcast, a fittingly somber mood for the final act of my long play. The auction took place as scheduled on the front steps of the county courthouse. It was a strange, anticlimactic affair. A small crowd had gathered, a few professional property investors with clipboards, a handful of curious onlookers, and a small, huddled group on the far side of the steps. It was Valerie, her lawyer, and a tearful friend. She looked utterly broken, a queen deposed from her throne. I stood at the back of the crowd, wearing sunglasses and a simple coat, my hands shoved in my pockets. I wasn't there to bid. Peregrine Holdings, as the primary lien holder, would be the default bidder. If no one bid higher than the outstanding debt, the property would revert to the LLC. To me, I was there to bear witness, to see the final stone of my father's foundation fall into place. The auctioneer began. He read the property description, the legal filings, the opening bid amount, the exact total of the remaining loan principal, plus fees and legal costs. He asked for any bids. An investor in a cheap suit offered $1,000 over the opening bid. My heart skipped a beat. Another investor countered. For a few tense minutes, a small bidding war erupted, the price climbing in small increments. I felt a strange sense of detachment. If they bought it, the LLC would be paid in full. I would have my money, the full value of the loan I had purchased. I would have my financial victory. But if no one bought it, I would have the house, the physical, tangible symbol of my father's legacy. In a way, I didn't care which way it went. Both outcomes were a form of justice. The bidding stalled, $50,000 above the opening bid. The first investor shook his head and stepped back. The auctioneer called out, going once, going twice, and then a new voice cut through the air. 1.5 million. Everyone turned. A man in a tailored suit, speaking quietly into a cell phone, had raised his bidding paddle. The other investors stared, then shook their heads and put away their clipboards. They were out. The auctioneer's eyes widened. Sold, he cried, banging his small wooden gavel. To the gentleman in the blue suit, it was over. The LLC, and therefore I, would be paid the full amount of the winning bid. Valerie, after my lien was satisfied, would receive whatever was left over, a pittance compared to what she had poured into the house. She had lost everything. I saw her crumple into the arms of her friend, her body shaking with sobs. As the crowd dispersed, I stayed put, watching the man in the blue suit speak with the auction officials. My own lawyer, Arthur, came to stand beside me. Well, kid, he said quietly, you got your money. A clean win. I know, I said, my eyes still fixed on the courthouse steps. Valerie finally saw me. Our eyes met across the 50 feet of concrete that separated us. Her face, already streaked with tears, twisted into a mask of pure, undiluted hatred. She said something to her lawyer, who shook his head, and then she turned and walked away, a defeated woman with nothing left but her rage. She never understood. She thought I wanted the money. She thought I wanted the house. But I didn't. I wanted to teach her a lesson my father never could. That foundations matter. And that when you build your life on stolen ground, it is only a matter of time before it all comes crashing down. I turned to Arthur, a feeling of profound, quiet peace settling over me for the first time in years. It's over, I said. It's finally over. He put a hand on my shoulder. Your father would be proud, Eli, he said, not of the revenge, but of the fact that you knew, when it mattered most, exactly how to build something that would last. The money from the auction settled into the Peregrine Holdings bank account with a quiet, digital finality. It was a staggering sum, more money than I had ever possessed. It was victory, represented by a string of numbers on a screen. The war was over, the enemy vanquished, and my father's stolen legacy was, in a sense, restored. And in the profound silence that followed, a strange and unsettling feeling began to creep in. A profound emptiness. For nearly 2 years, my life had been governed by a single, all-consuming purpose. Every spare thought, every ounce of intellectual energy, every quiet moment had been dedicated to the meticulous, step-by-step dismantling of Valerie's life. My grief for my father had been channeled into this cold, complex project. My anger had been converted into legal strategy. My pain had been repurposed as fuel. The plan had become my foundation, the intricate structure of it holding me up, giving me a reason to get out of bed every morning. Now, it was gone. I would wake up and my mind would instinctively reach for the next step, the next document to file, the next angle to consider, only to find nothing there. The war room in my mind was empty. I found myself aimlessly scrolling through news articles about property auctions or rereading the cold, formal correspondence between Peregrine Holdings and Valerie's lawyers. It was like a soldier, returning from a long war, who still hears the phantom sound of gunfire in the silence. My partner, Michael, noticed the shift in me. You seem adrift, he said one night, as we sat on the sofa. I had been staring blankly at the television, not having registered a single moment of the movie we were supposed to be watching. The project is over, I said, the words feeling inadequate. I won. You did, he said, gently, taking my hand. It was a brilliant, incredible victory. But the fight was the purpose for so long. Now you have to figure out what to do with the piece, His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was right. I had spent so long focused on tearing something down that I had forgotten how to build. And as I looked at the massive balance in the Peregrine Holdings account, I realized I had another problem. The money felt dirty. It wasn't the clean, honest inheritance my father had left me. It was the spoils of war, stained with the ugliness of my battle with Valerie. The thought of using it to buy a new car or take a lavish vacation felt repulsive, like I would just be mimicking her own shallow behavior. Using it for my own pleasure felt like a betrayal of the very principle I had fought for. The money wasn't a prize, it was a responsibility. The answer, when it came, felt so obvious, so right, that I wondered why I hadn't seen it sooner. It came to me in my father's old office, surrounded by his books. I pulled one of his college yearbooks from the shelf. There he was, a young man with a slide rule in his pocket and a hopeful, determined look in his eyes. He had been a scholarship student. Someone, long ago, had invested in his potential. And I remembered him talking, years ago, about a dream he'd had. One day, Eli, he'd said, when I've got enough put away, I want to start a scholarship for some kid like me, someone with the brains but not the money, help them build their own foundation. He never got the chance. Valerie had stolen that chance from him, had converted that dream into an infinity pool and marble countertops. A new kind of anger, a clean and righteous anger, burned through me. My purpose was suddenly crystal clear. I wasn't just going to put the money to good use. I was going to launder it spiritually. I was going to take the ugly, tainted capital of my revenge and transform it into the clean, hopeful foundation of someone else's future. I wasn't just going to close the book on Valerie. I was going to write a new, better chapter in my father's name. My first call was to Arthur. I need you to draw up paperwork for a new entity, I said, a new energy buzzing in my voice. A non-profit foundation. Oh, he said, his interest piqued. And what's the name of this one? Kestrel Conglomerated. Goshawk Group, I laughed. The first genuine, light-hearted laugh I'd had in months. No more birds of prey, Arthur, I said. This one is different. I want to call it the Jansen Foundation for Structural Integrity. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he spoke. Now that, he said, with deep satisfaction, is what I call building something to last. The weeks that followed were a blur of purposeful activity. We legally dissolved Peregrine Holdings LLC, that cold, predatory vessel of my anger. The name itself felt like an artifact from another life. Then, we funneled every penny from its accounts into the new foundation. I spent my evenings and weekends not researching property law, but drafting the charter and bylaws for the foundation. I wanted the scholarship to be a true reflection of my father. It wouldn't be based on grades alone. I wrote criteria that focused on passion, on innovative thinking, on financial need. I included an essay portion where applicants had to answer a simple question. What is the most important thing you want to build, and why? Every clause I wrote, every rule I defined, felt like an act of healing. I was taking the rubble of my past and using it to build something clean and strong and new. The final step was a quiet, personal one. I designed the foundation's logo myself. It was a simple, elegant graphic, a stylized letter J for Jansen, that also formed the cross-section of a perfectly balanced bridge, its arch strong and supportive. It was a symbol of connection, of support, of holding things up rather than tearing them down. A year later, I was sitting in the back of a university auditorium. It was the annual awards ceremony for the School of Engineering, my father's alma mater. I was there as an anonymous guest of the dean. No one knew who I was, or that the new scholarship being presented for the first time was mine. I watched as a young woman named Maria Hernandez was called to the stage. She was bright-eyed and nervous, clutching a small index card. She spoke about her dream of designing low-cost, earthquake-resistant housing for developing nations. She talked about her family, who had sacrificed so much for her education. And then she spoke about the scholarship. I didn't know if I could afford to finish my degree next year, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But the Jansen Foundation, they didn't just give me money. They gave me a vote of confidence. They invested in my foundation. And I promise I will spend my life building things worthy of that investment. Tears streamed down my face as I listened. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that dwarfed the cold satisfaction of my victory over Valerie. This was the real justice. This was the real win. The money was no longer stained. It had been transformed into hope. It was building something. I slipped out before the end of the ceremony, my heart full. Michael was waiting for me outside, and he wrapped his arm around me. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm perfect," I said, and I meant it. We walked in comfortable silence, the evening air cool and fresh. My revenge on Valerie had been a closed loop, a story of an eye for an eye that had ended in an empty victory. But this was different. This was a story that had just begun. My father's real legacy wasn't in an investment account. It was in the strength of the things he built, the ideas he inspired, and now, in the future of a brilliant young woman who would go on to build amazing things of her own. I hadn't just brought a house down. I had helped build a dozen more, and that was a foundation that could withstand anything. Of course, here is the continuation of the novel. The money from the auction settled into the Peregrine Holdings bank account with a quiet digital finality. It was a staggering sum, more money than I had ever possessed. It was victory, represented by a string of numbers on a screen. The war was over, the enemy vanquished, and my father's stolen legacy was, in a sense, restored. And in the profound silence that followed, a strange and unsettling feeling began to creep in. A profound emptiness. For nearly 2 years, my life had been governed by a single, all-consuming purpose. Every spare thought, every ounce of intellectual energy, every quiet moment had been dedicated to the meticulous, step-by-step dismantling of Valerie's life. My grief for my father had been channeled into this cold, complex project. My anger had been converted into legal strategy. My pain had been repurposed as fuel. The plan had become my foundation, the intricate structure of it holding me up, giving me a reason to get out of bed every morning. Now, it was gone. I would wake up and my mind would instinctively reach for the next step, the next document to file, the next angle to consider, only to find nothing there. The war room in my mind was empty. I found myself aimlessly scrolling through news articles about property auctions or rereading the cold, formal correspondence between Peregrine Holdings and Valerie's lawyers. It was like a soldier, returning from a long war, who still hears the phantom sound of gunfire in the silence. My partner, Michael, noticed the shift in me. "You seem adrift," he said one night as we sat on the sofa. I had been staring blankly at the television, not having registered a single moment of the movie we were supposed to be watching. "The project is over," I said, the words feeling inadequate. "I won." "You did," he said, gently, taking my hand. It was a brilliant, incredible victory. But the fight was the purpose for so long. Now you have to figure out what to do with the piece. His words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He was right. I had spent so long focused on tearing something down that I had forgotten how to build. And as I looked at the massive balance in the Peregrine Holdings account, I realized I had another problem. The money felt dirty. It wasn't the clean, honest inheritance my father had left me. It was the spoils of war, stained with the ugliness of my battle with Valerie. The thought of using it to buy a new car or take a lavish vacation felt repulsive, like I would just be mimicking her own shallow behavior. Using it for my own pleasure felt like a betrayal of the very principle I had fought for. The money wasn't a prize, it was a responsibility. The answer, when it came, felt so obvious, so right, that I wondered why I hadn't seen it sooner. It came to me in my father's old office, surrounded by his books. I pulled one of his college yearbooks from the shelf. There he was, a young man with a slide rule in his pocket and a hopeful, determined look in his eyes. He had been a scholarship student. Someone, long ago, had invested in his potential. And I remembered him talking, years ago, about a dream he'd had. "One day, Eli," he'd said, "when I've got enough put away, I want to start a scholarship for some kid like me, someone with the brains but not the money. Help them build their own foundation." He never got the chance. Valerie had stolen that chance from him, had converted that dream into an infinity pool and marble countertops. A new kind of anger, a clean and righteous anger, burned through me. My purpose was suddenly crystal clear. I wasn't just going to put the money to good use. I was going to launder it spiritually. I was going to take the ugly, tainted capital of my revenge and transform it into the clean, hopeful foundation of someone else's future. I wasn't just going to close the book on Valerie. I was going to write a new, better chapter in my father's name. My first call was to Arthur. "I need you to draw up paperwork for a new entity," I said, a new energy buzzing in my voice. "A non-profit foundation." "Oh," he said, his interest piqued. And what's the name of this one? Kestrel Conglomerated. Goshawk Group, I laughed, the first genuine, light-hearted laugh I'd had in months. No more birds of prey, Arthur, I said. This one is different. I want to call it the Janssen Foundation for Structural Integrity. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear the smile in his voice when he spoke. Now that, he said, with deep satisfaction, is what I call building something to last. The weeks that followed were a blur of purposeful activity. We legally dissolved Peregrine Holdings LLC, that cold, predatory vessel of my anger. The name itself felt like an artifact from another life. Then, we funneled every penny from its accounts into the new foundation. I spent my evenings and weekends not researching property law, but drafting the charter and bylaws for the foundation. I wanted the scholarship to be a true reflection of my father. It wouldn't be based on grades alone. I wrote criteria that focused on passion, on innovative thinking, on financial need. I included an essay portion where applicants had to answer a simple question. What is the most important thing you want to build, and why? Every clause I wrote, every rule I defined, felt like an act of healing. I was taking the rubble of my past and using it to build something clean and strong and new. The final step was a quiet, personal one. I designed the foundation's logo myself. It was a simple, elegant graphic, a stylized letter J for Janssen, that also formed the cross-section of a perfectly balanced bridge, its arch strong and supportive. It was a symbol of connection, of support, of holding things up rather than tearing them down. A year later, I was sitting in the back of a university auditorium. It was the annual awards ceremony for the School of Engineering, my father's alma mater. I was there as an anonymous guest of the dean. No one knew who I was, or that the new scholarship being presented for the first time was mine. I watched as a young woman named Maria Hernandez was called to the stage. She was bright-eyed and nervous, clutching a small index card. She spoke about her dream of designing low-cost, earthquake-resistant housing for developing nations. She talked about her family, who had sacrificed so much for her education. And then she spoke about the scholarship. I didn't know if I could afford to finish my degree next year, she said, her voice thick with emotion. But the Janssen Foundation, they didn't just give me money. They gave me a vote of confidence. They invested in my foundation, and I promise I will spend my life building things worthy of that investment. Tears streamed down my face as I listened. In that moment, I felt a sense of peace that dwarfed the cold satisfaction of my victory over Valerie. This was the real justice. This was the real win. The money was no longer stained. It had been transformed into hope. It was building something. I slipped out before the end of the ceremony, my heart full. Michael was waiting for me outside, and he wrapped his arm around me. You okay? He asked. I'm perfect, I said, and I meant it. We walked in comfortable silence, the evening air cool and fresh. My revenge on Valerie had been a closed loop, a story of an eye for an eye that had ended in an empty victory. But this was different. This was a story that had just begun. My father's real legacy wasn't in an investment account. It was in the strength of the things he built, the ideas he inspired, and now, in the future of a brilliant young woman who would go on to build amazing things of her own. I hadn't just brought a house down. I had helped build a dozen more. And that was a foundation that could withstand anything. Of course, here is a further continuation of the novel, adding more depth and length to the story's conclusion. The first year of the Janssen Foundation's existence was one of quiet, satisfying work. We funded 2 more scholarships, and I received heartfelt, grateful letters from the recipients that I kept in a file labeled, simply, Foundations. My life with Michael deepened into a partnership so comfortable and strong it felt like it had always been there. The ghost of Valerie, and the war I had waged, had finally receded, becoming a part of my history rather than a defining feature of my present. The peace was real, and yet, a new, gentler kind of restlessness began to stir within me. The foundation was my father's legacy, but I was running it from a distance. I was a signature on a check, a name at the bottom of an email. I had built this powerful engine for good, but I wasn't in the driver's seat. I was merely the owner. After watching Maria Hernandez give her speech at the awards ceremony, I felt a powerful pull to do more, to be more than an anonymous benefactor. The connection I felt in that moment was something I wanted to nurture. I wanted to see the impact of my father's legacy up close. I wanted to help build, not just fund. I'm thinking of offering a mentorship. I told Michael one evening. To Maria, the first scholarship winner, I could advise her on her career path, help her network. I feel like I should be doing more than just sending money. I think that's a great idea, he said, his support immediate and unquestioning. Your father wasn't just an engineer. He was a mentor to dozens of young people at his firm. It's part of his legacy too. I also ran the idea by Arthur, who was, as always, the voice of cautious pragmatism. Just be careful, Eli, he warned over the phone. The line between benefactor and friend can get blurry. Maintain a professional boundary. You've earned your peace. Don't let new complications threaten it. I knew he was right, but my gut told me this was a necessary step. I sent an email to Maria from my official foundation address, introducing myself as the director and proposing a mentorship lunch to discuss her future. She responded within the hour, her email overflowing with enthusiasm. We set a date for the following week. The lunch was everything I had hoped it would be. Maria was even more impressive in person, articulate, fiercely intelligent, and deeply passionate about her field. We talked for 2 hours about everything from the tensile strength of new composite materials to the challenges of being a woman in a male-dominated industry. I saw so much of my father's spirit in her, that same excited gleam in her eye when talking about the beautiful mathematics of a well-designed structure. It was as we were finishing our coffee that the conversation shifted. I asked about her family, and a shadow passed over her bright features. They're so proud, she said, a small, worried frown appearing on her face. But they're worried right now. We're all worried. Is everything okay? I asked gently. She hesitated, clearly unsure if she should be burdening me with her problems. It's our apartment, she said finally, her voice dropping. We've lived there for 15 years. It's rent-controlled. But the man who owned the building just sold it. The new owners are aggressive. They're a big property group. They sent letters to everyone, saying they're planning major renovations and that our leases won't be renewed. My parents don't know where we'll go. We can't afford anything else in that neighborhood. A cold dread, a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, began to creep up my spine. It was the familiar chill of injustice. What's the name of the property group? I asked, my voice suddenly tight. Apex Real Estate Holdings, she said. Do you know them? The name meant nothing to me, but the strategy was sickeningly familiar. A legal, by-the-book method of displacing people for profit. It was the kind of systemic, faceless cruelty that made what Valerie did seem almost quaint by comparison. This wasn't one greedy woman. This was a machine. I'm so sorry to hear that, Maria, I said, my mind already racing. That must be incredibly stressful. We finished our lunch, and I promised to help her with her resume, to connect her with some contacts for a summer internship. But as I walked away, my promise felt hollow. What good was an internship if her family was about to lose their home? The foundation of her life was being threatened, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not stand by and do nothing. The battle with Valerie hadn't been the end of my story. It had been my education, and I was about to put my skills to use again. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I descended into a rabbit hole of public records, property deeds, and corporate filings, the same dark world I had inhabited during my war with Valerie. But this time, my anger wasn't personal. It was a cold, clear rage directed at a system. Apex Real Estate Holdings was, as I suspected, a vulture. They had a clear pattern: buy up older, rent-controlled buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods, use legal loopholes to evict long-term, lower-income tenants, perform cosmetic renovations, and then double or triple the rent. It was all perfectly legal, and it was utterly immoral. I found articles detailing their tactics. They would refuse to make repairs, letting conditions deteriorate until tenants were forced to leave. They would levy huge, questionable fees for minor infractions. They would serve eviction notices based on the flimsiest of pretexts, knowing that most tenants couldn't afford the legal fight to challenge them. They were preying on the vulnerable, using the law itself as their weapon. This was a dragon far bigger than Valerie. My meticulously planned foreclosure had been a scalpel, used for a single, precise surgery. To fight Apex, I would need a battering ram. My first step was a meeting with the foundation's board, which consisted of me, Arthur, and 2 of my father's most trusted colleagues. I presented my findings in a conference room that buzzed with tension. I told them about Maria, about her family, about the systemic injustice being perpetrated by Apex. This is a housing issue, Eli, not an educational one of the board members, a practical man named George, pointed out. Our charter is very specific. We fund scholarships. Is it? I countered, my voice ringing with a passion that surprised even me. What good is a scholarship if the student is homeless? What good is funding a brilliant mind if that mind is consumed with worry about where her family will sleep at night? My father believed in structural integrity. Well, a community is a structure. A family is a structure. And this is a foundational crisis. If we ignore this, then our mission is nothing but empty words on a piece of paper. I laid out my proposal. I wanted to amend the foundation's charter. I wanted to create a new wing, a community stability fund. This fund would be dedicated to providing pro bono legal services and emergency grants to families in our city who were facing wrongful eviction or predatory housing practices. We wouldn't just give students a leg up. We would make sure they had solid ground to stand on. Arthur was the first to speak. He looked at me, a slow, proud smile spreading across his face. Your father always said that the purpose of a bridge isn't just to cross a river, he said, his voice thick with emotion. It's to connect communities, to make them stronger. This is what he would have wanted. I vote yes. By the end of the meeting, the vote was unanimous. The Jansen Foundation was officially entering a new fight. The work that followed was even more consuming than my campaign against Valerie. We hired a brilliant, aggressive tenant rights lawyer named Sarah, who immediately filed a class action lawsuit against Apex on behalf of all the families in Maria's building. I spent my nights and weekends helping her team, using my research skills to uncover every shell corporation, every hidden partner, every shady deal in Apex's history. We organized the tenants, holding meetings in the cramped community room of their building. I wasn't an anonymous director anymore. I was on the ground, listening to stories, offering support, fighting alongside them. Maria was there at every meeting, a fierce advocate for her family and her neighbors. Seeing her in action, her brilliant mind now focused on this new, urgent problem, I knew I had made the right choice. We were helping her build something far more important than a career. We were helping her save her community. The legal battle raged for almost a year. Apex fought back with all the power of their corporate lawyers, but we had truth and a mountain of evidence on our side. They had expected their tenants to be disorganized and powerless. They had not expected them to be backed by a foundation with deep pockets and a director who knew exactly how to dismantle a house of cards. The victory came not in a courtroom, but at a negotiation table. Faced with a damaging public lawsuit and undeniable proof of their predatory patterns, Apex settled. They agreed to halt the evictions, sell the building at a fair price to a nonprofit housing trust, and pay a substantial settlement to the tenants for harassment. The night the settlement was announced, the tenants held a celebration in the community room. The room was filled with food and music and the joyous, relieved laughter of families who had won back their homes. Maria found me standing in the back, just watching. We did it, she said, her eyes shining with tears. Thank you, Eli. You didn't just give me a scholarship. You gave my family our future. You all did this, I said, my own voice thick. You fought for it. As I looked around the room, at the children running and playing, at the elderly couples dancing, at the vibrant, resilient community that had refused to be broken, I finally understood. The foreclosure on Valerie's house wasn't the end of my story. It wasn't the victory. It was the forge. It was the fire that had burned away my grief and my naivete and had forged me into the weapon I needed to be. But a weapon is only a tool. The real victory wasn't in the tearing down. It was here, in this room, in the building up. My father's legacy was safe. It was living and breathing in the foundations of these families, in the strength of this community, and in the purpose I had finally, truly found for myself. My work was just beginning, of course. Here is a further addition to the novel, extending the story to its final conclusion. The victory against Apex Real Estate Holdings marked a significant turning point, not just for the foundation, but for me. The fight with Valerie had been a deeply personal crusade, a war fought in the shadows for my own vindication. But this new battle was fought in the open, on behalf of others. It solidified the transformation of my life's purpose from one of personal revenge to one of public advocacy. The Jansen Foundation became my all-consuming passion, and the work was more rewarding than I could have ever imagined. We grew. In the 5 years that followed, our community stability fund helped hundreds of families. We became a well-known and respected thorn in the side of every predatory landlord in the city. Our legal victories set new precedents in tenant rights. The scholarship program flourished, and I took great pride in personally mentoring each recipient, creating a network of bright, ethical, and community-minded professionals who were all, in their own way, extensions of my father's legacy. We had moved from a small office to our own building downtown, a modest, 3-story brick structure that we renovated, a physical symbol of our permanence and our commitment. It was a house built on a foundation of justice, and it was open to everyone. My personal life bloomed in the space cleared by this new purpose. Michael and I were married in a simple ceremony in my father's favorite park. We bought a home with a small yard and a 2-car garage, where the Mustang now spent most of its time under a cover, a cherished relic of a past life, brought out only for special Sunday drives. Our daughter, Lily, was born, a bright, laughing girl with my father's kind eyes. My life was full. It was a life I had built, not on the ruins of my enemy, but on the principles my father had taught me. The past rarely intruded. It was a sealed chapter. I knew, through the family grapevine, that Valerie had vanished from the society pages. After the foreclosure, she had moved to a small apartment in a neighboring state, living a quiet, diminished life, funded by whatever pittance was left over from the auction. She was a ghost, a cautionary tale. As for Sasha, I heard she had married and moved to the Midwest. I felt nothing about this news, not anger, not satisfaction, just a profound and complete indifference. Their lives were their own, and they had no bearing on mine. The past, however, has a way of sending one final echo. 10 years after the tenant victory against Apex, I received a call from my mother. "Eli," she said, her voice soft, "I wanted to let you know, your Aunt Carol passed away this morning." The news landed not with a shock, but with a quiet, somber weight. Carol, the architect of so much of my early pain, the enabler, the manipulator. I felt a flicker of the old anger, quickly replaced by a wave of weary sadness for the family she had so thoroughly broken. The funeral was to be held that weekend. I had no obligation to go. No one would expect me to, but I knew I had to. Not for Carol, and not for the family, but for me. To stand in that final place and close the chapter for good. The funeral home was just as I remembered it from my father's service, all hushed tones and funereal flowers. I slipped into a pew at the very back, an anonymous observer. I saw my cousins, my uncles. They looked older, wearier. Then I saw Sasha. She stood near the front, beside the casket. She wasn't the stylish, self-important girl I remembered, nor the pale, defeated woman from the hospice. She was a plain-looking woman in her 40s, with tired lines around her eyes, holding the hand of a small boy who looked about Lily's age. She looked ordinary. She looked like any other woman grieving her mother. Our eyes met for a fleeting second across the crowded room. There was no anger in her gaze, no pleading, just a flicker of weary recognition, acknowledgement. In that single, silent moment, an unspoken treaty was signed. We were no longer protagonist and antagonist. We were just two women whose lives had once been tangled in a painful, destructive knot, a knot that had long since been severed. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and then turned back to her son. I didn't stay for the reception. My presence had served its purpose. As I walked out into the cool afternoon air, I felt the last, lingering threads of the past fall away. The anger was gone. The need for justice was gone. All that was left was a clean, quiet peace. The story was finally, truly, over. Later that day, I drove to the Foundation's headquarters. I let myself into the quiet building and went up to my office. From my window, I could see the city stretching out, a complex network of buildings, bridges, and lives, all interconnected. I thought about my father, the engineer, who understood that the strength of a structure is determined by its ability to bear a load, to withstand pressure, to transfer stress away from its weakest points. Valerie's betrayal had been a seismic shock to the foundation of my life. My revenge, the foreclosure, had been my attempt to shore up the damage, to prove that my own structure would not collapse. But that wasn't the end of the story. That was just the repair work. The real work, the work that mattered, was everything that came after. It was the scholarships, the mentorships, the families we helped, the communities we strengthened. It was the slow, patient, and joyful work of building. My father's true inheritance, I finally understood, wasn't the money in the investment account. It was the blueprint he had left me, a blueprint for a life built with integrity, a legacy not of wealth but of strength, not of revenge but of restoration. I had taken the ugliest, most painful event of my life and used it as the foundational stone for a future that was bigger and better than I could have ever imagined. I had honored him, and in doing so, I had finally, truly, come home to myself.